Chapter 69, Interlude, To Love a Dragon. After the emotional end to the storytelling, the entire group decided to make an early night of it. Celestia lowered the sun, Luna raised the moon, and the whole group curled up for sleep around the map. No one was that surprised that Gandreda found her way to curl up against Spike during the night, though it was a little surprising to a few that Rarity and Cadence also wound up curled against the energy being. As the group went different ways for various tasks, Gore with Twilight and Samus to get more answers about this new world, Rondas to chill with Rainbow and Pinkie, and others to various chores or relaxation activities, the Diarchs availed themselves of the Ponyville spa. Rarity surprised everyone by dragging Gandreda off to her boutique, closely followed by Cadence. She also suggested to Spike that he take some guy time with Shining Armor and Discord before that afternoon if he planned to take Gandreda out for dinner later. The Crusaders had laughed uproariously at Spike's expression, apparently torn between startled and pleased that Rarity could still seemingly read his mind about such things. Gandreda didn't take too kindly to being dragged off to a dress shop. "Why do I have to do this, anyway?" she demanded angrily as she was left on a raised platform while Rarity took measurements. "I don't normally wear clothes, anyway." "Different occasions call for different approaches, darling," Rarity explained mildly. "What do you think Spike would think if you showed up for a date without a stitch, like you expected to fight something?" "Probably that I'm a lot like his mom's," Gandreda countered. "Besides, I'm not sure I want to take fashion advice from a member of a race that normally walks around naked anyway." As Cadence giggled, Rarity rolled her eyes. "You want Spike to see another side of you, don't you?" she chided. "To see you as a young lady looking to court, rather than the more wanton aspects you presented in trying to be tough? The aspects that caused such a long-standing miscommunication?" When Gandreda said nothing, Rarity went back to taking measurements. "Leave this to me, then. Assuming they haven't changed too much, I know Spike's taste in fashion quite well, and exactly how to make you look your best for him." She glanced over the somewhat spiky projections that rose from the back of Gandreda's head. "Pity there isn't more to work with in regards to hair, but I can make it work." As Rarity began taking notes, Gandreda stared at her for a time. "Why do all this?" she demanded finally. "From the way you were acting before, I thought you'd staked a claim on him. Why help me woo him?" Rarity paused in mid-sketch, then continued. "That's a long story, Gandreda, and it goes all the way back to the day I first met him. Are you sure you want to hear?" Gandreda nodded firmly. "I think I do." Rarity smiled softly as she continued. "The first time I met him, he was this tiny little baby dragon, about Sweetie Belle's size. Plainly only a child, but he fell head over heels for me at first sight. While flattered, I brushed it off at first. It was hardly the first time a young colt had become smitten with me. I was certain he'd have forgotten about it in a few days, especially considering other events that happened not long after." "Other events?" Gandreda asked, confused. "Eternal night, the return of Nightmare Moon, the near collapse of the equestrian government and destruction of the world," Rarity replied offhandedly. "You know, little things like that." "You've dealt with that sort of thing a lot?" Gandreda asked, beginning to re-evaluate the pony before her. "Well, that was the first time," Rarity admitted. "At any rate, after that I was rather surprised that Spike was still smitten with me, and going well out of his way to do anything he could to assist me, just to spend time with me." Rarity glanced from Cadence to Gandreda sheepishly. "I'm ashamed to admit that I took advantage of his devotion right at first. I was a bit shallow back then, and the idea of someone eager to wait on me hoof and claw like that," she sighed sadly. "And yet he never once complained, never once even hinted that he didn't like it. He was simply overjoyed to do anything for me, if I would just give him the time of day. When I realized that, I felt simply awful, and I knew I had to put a stop to it. But I couldn't just reject him outright. That would destroy him." She shook her head to dispel unpleasant thoughts. "So I decided to disillusion him instead. I started asking him to do unpleasant or more difficult tasks, nothing he couldn't do, but enough to make sure he saw me in different lights, so he would see the real me, and not whatever ideal he thought I represented. But, it didn't work. The more he learned of me, the more devoted he became, even when I swooned after one stallion or another. When, inevitably, I came back heartbroken, he was always right there. Rarity paused in her storytelling to consult on her design quietly with Cadence, letting Gandrata soak in everything she'd said. Eventually, Gandrata spoke up. "He's always been incredibly loyal," she murmured. "Yes," Rarity replied as she continued her work. "It makes me wonder about the old nature versus nurture debate in regard to him," she sighed. "And, when I realized just how dedicated and devoted he was to me, and how much I come to rely on him being there, I gave serious thought to how to let him down gently with words, so he could pursue someone that would be better for him. I just wanted what was best for him, but the more I thought about it, the more painful the idea of him not being there anymore became. I realized, I come to care for him, as more than a friend if not in the same way he cared for me." "A spark sibling," Gandrata replied. "One as close to you as if you were born from the same spark of life." "What a poetic way of putting it," Rarity gushed happily. "And, yes, I suppose that's about right. I feel much the same way about Twilight and the others, but there was something more with Spike. I was actually on my way to talk with Twilight about it when the accident happened, and Spike went missing. Those 2 months, they were the most painful of my life," Rarity continued sadly. I tried to stay strong for Twilight, but, behind closed doors, the sorrow of not knowing what had happened to him was crippling. My designs took a dour turn those months, I admit." "And then he came back," Gandrata inferred. "Yes," Rarity sighed dreamily. "At first, I was just overjoyed to know Spike had returned. I didn't care about how different he might be. I was overjoyed to rush to his side, wrap him in my forelegs and kiss his precious scales to welcome him home, and then I saw just how much he had changed. For a moment, I saw not little Spiky Wicky, but a huge beast, all teeth and claws. And then, he smiled, acting apologetic for making us nervous, and shrank himself down to make us more comfortable. Right there, I saw that however much he changed, had seen, had grown, he was still the same caring, compassionate, devoted Drake he'd always been. The little squire had just grown up to become the knight he'd always envisioned himself to become one day. And what a knight he had become!" Rarity's tone changed from reminiscent to more than a bit starstruck. "That shimmering white armor, only slightly more bright than his own scales. The same kind eyes, the claws sharp enough to cut steel, yet gentle enough for a tender caress, and those muscles." Rarity shivered a bit in delight just from remembering. And then how casually he spoke of his power, and of the things he'd done to protect those he cared about. Rarity smiled a bit sheepishly. "I'm not sure why, as I've never been fond of violence in any form, but I got more and more excited with every tale of the viciousness he displayed in protecting those he cared for." "It's instinctive," Cadence explained. "Before ponies became civilized, we grouped in herds, with several mares banding together for safety when foaling with only a few stallions around. The stallions would often fight, sometimes to the death, with each other or enemies to prove themselves. A stallion that was gentle with the mares but vicious with enemies, while strong enough to protect many, that was the ideal sire to foals," she chuckled. "The reason you reacted so strongly to Spike is because the little guy you were so fond of for so long suddenly started pushing every single one of your instinctive buttons." Gandrata couldn't help but chuckle at the face Rarity was making in response to that. "That still doesn't explain why you're helping me snag him. It sounds like you want to snag him." "And that's why I'm helping you snag him," Rarity finished. "Do you think you could send a little bit of your energy over here?" Gandrata was so stupefied by Rarity's first statement that she didn't even think twice before granting the request. "What?" Rarity chuckled as she wove the energy into the fabric she was working with. "You see, Spike is still Spike. He still cares more for the happiness of others than for himself, and more for his friendships than romance. He'd sooner go without romance than risk it damaging his bonds with his friends, or his friends' bonds with each other. If we were to actually fight over him, all it would do is hurt him, push him away." "Huh," Gandrata admitted thoughtfully. "I know you're right, it's part of what drew me to him to begin with, but I never would have imagined a guy who didn't want girls fighting over him. Oh, a bit of competition he won't mind, and he'll probably enjoy watching, as long as it's friendly," Rarity replied easily. After all, you and I are hardly the only ones who've come to see him this way now. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Rainbow Dash and Applejack decided to wrestle over whose turn it was to spend time with him, and invite him to watch. He might feel awkward about it, but he wouldn't say nay or be turned away, she chuckled softly. But that's Rainbow and Applejack. They're always competing over something, it's just how they are. But the minute any of us start treating Spike as a prize, is the moment we've lost. Then, how does helping me help you? Gandrada repeated, going back to her original question. Because Spike cares about you, and wants you to be happy, Rarity concluded as she finished the dress. And I want him to be happy. If things work out for the two of you, I can take pride in knowing I played a hoof in it, and I know I'll always be close to you both. If it doesn't, you'll both stay friends, and the work I put to helping you will count in my favor when it's my turn to try my hoof at winning him over. Alternatively, Cadance offered, if things do work out with the two of you, but it turns out Spike is too much dragon for one lady to handle alone, Rarity's on good terms with both of you as far as becoming first co-wife. Seeing the startled looks on both of their faces, Cadance chuckled. What? Dragons amongst their own kind are only rarely monogamous, and the herd relationship only went out of style amongst ponies. It's still part of our traditions and culture. And given Samus' approach to romance, I doubt if Spike would have any reservations about a group dynamic should he feel it appropriate. How about I try that dress on? Gandrada asked quickly. Before I start testing the limits of my xenophilia, she added silently to herself. Smiling, Rarity levitated it over to Gandrada and slipped it over her figure, before turning her to see her reflection. What do you think? She asked softly. The dress was a seamless mix of pale pink and bright green, blending together like a fragment of an alien sky. It hung off Gandrada's left shoulder from a single strap, covering her completely without breaks down to her left knee. It hung loosely around her, the right train going all the way down to her ankle. And on top of everything else, it flowed around her constantly, not unlike Celestia's mane and tail. It's amazing, she whispered softly. Cadance explained to me how Princess Celestia and Princess Luna make their manes and tails flow, Rarity explained. It has to do with an expression of their magical energy. I thought blending a little of your own energy into the fabric might do that for you, and it seems to have worked. Rarity then lowered her head, gazing at Gandrada's feet. I think low heels might complete the look, though I've never worked shoes before. Smiling, Gandrada raised herself up on her toes before shaping low heels under her feet from her own energy. You're right! This does look even better! Think Spike will like it? You could just ask me! Gandrada stifled a gasp as she spun, finding Spike smiling at her from the doorway. How long have you been there? She asked, more than a bit worried he'd heard the bit about group dynamics and either gotten ideas or been scared away. Just got here, Spike replied easily. You did a wonderful job, Rarity. I aim to please, Rarity replied with a smile. Spike held his hand out to Gandrada. Ready? Smiling, Gandrada shyly reached out to take the offered hand.